By the summer of 1964, the United States was more deeply involved in Vietnam than most people understood or appreciated. John Kennedy had put some 16,000 American troops, advisors they were called, military advisors, into Vietnam, and this was the beginning of America's very substantial military commitment. There was a strong anti-communist feeling in the country. There was a belief in the idea that you had to stop communism wherever it became aggressive. This was seen as a conflict over what was known as national wars of liberation. These were guerrilla wars, and if they succeeded in Vietnam, it would embolden them to be aggressive in other parts of the world. This was seen as a testing ground, and I think generally the American public found themselves very sympathetic to doing something about keeping South Vietnam from, quote-unquote, going communist. And Johnson kept saying that he cannot afford to lose Vietnam, and he's not going to lose Vietnam. Therefore, in the summer of '64, August, when there was an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin, when North Vietnamese PT boats are alleged to have attacked American destroyers, Johnson jumped on this episode and put a resolution before the United States Congress asking for an endorsement of his administration's policy or the right to take strong action in defense of American interests and defense of America's allies in Vietnam. And the Senate, for example, passed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution with only 2 dissenting votes. So what it did was it gave Johnson a kind of mandate to take action in Vietnam. And what he said privately afterwards is that the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution is like grandma's nightshirt. It covered everything. In 1965 and 66, Johnson substantially escalates American involvement in the war. The public is initially receptive and supportive of this action, but very quickly a protest movement springs up on the campuses of the United States. The first teach-in against the war occurs at the University of Michigan. And students who see the war as a diversion away from the civil rights movement and the Great Society programs, from the domestic reforms that Johnson had been pushing so hard for in '64 and '65, they complain that the war, on the one hand, is a diversion away from domestic affairs, and on the other hand, it's an inappropriate attack upon a national liberation movement that is less communist than it is nationalistic, and that Johnson and others in the country see this communist threat as greater than in fact it really is. If you have communism in South Vietnam, young people are saying, not all by any means, but protesters are saying, it's their business. This is a civil war that's going on in Vietnam. This is not part of a worldwide communist movement. Johnson doesn't believe that. Johnson is a Cold Warrior, as John Kennedy had been, as Eisenhower had been, as Truman had been. He's a Cold Warrior going back to the early days of the Cold War, and he feels that's essential for the United States to stand up to this communist challenge. And so did Johnson's advisors, most of whom were John Kennedy's advisors. And as David Halberstam said in his famous book, The Best and the Brightest, it was the best and the brightest who were urging him toward escalation of this war. Now, you get a protest movement that begins on campuses and spreads. It grows like a cancer. It is a very powerful and in some ways all-consuming movement. And it's fed by the fact that the war is not going well. It's fed by the fact that there begin to be terrible losses in blood and treasure for Americans, so much so that by 1968, the United States has lost some 30,000 men in the fighting, and there seems to be no end in sight. And Americans begin to wonder, when will this stop? How long will this go on for? Is it worth the price that we're paying? And the answer begins to be probably not. No, we don't need to engage in this kind of bloodletting. Others are saying, look, if we're going to do it, let's go after them in a much more aggressive way. If we're really going to fight this war, let's get on with it. We have the power to take care of those North Vietnamese. Now, of course, what Johnson does, and will happen later in the Nixon administration. But what Johnson does is strategic bombing. They bomb the hell out of North Vietnam. They drop massive amounts of tonnage. By the end of the Vietnam War, we've dropped something like 3 times the tonnage that we used in all of World War II. It is a massive use of American air power. But it doesn't seem to work. It doesn't seem to stop the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese from the struggle that they're pursuing. And so there's great frustration that sets in the country, and it feeds the protest movement, and it frustrates Johnson, who becomes more and more antagonistic toward the protesters, and a yawning gulf opens in the country between opponents of the war and supporters of the war, and there is terrible social dislocation now, and the great society is being killed off. Indeed, this is an adage of American history, that war kills reform. It happened in the 1890s with the Spanish-American War, World War I with progressivism, World War II with the New Deal, and it happens again with Johnson and Vietnam and the Great Society. Johnson reacts to the protests and the opposition with great anger and frustration. There are anecdotes of him sitting in the White House talking to advisors, drinking Dr. Pepper and munching potato chips, and talking about the way in which the communists have infiltrated the opposition, the protest movements. In fact, he says, a lot of the journalists who are opposing the war, they get their articles, they get their script from the Soviet embassy. They're taking their cue from the Soviets. Well, of course, this was a gross distortion, but Johnson was so angry and so frustrated, he was overreacting to the expressions of protests against the war, and over the attacks upon him as some kind of conservative or reactionary. He kept saying, I'm the education president. I'm the guy who put across these civil rights programs. I'm the guy who is the Great Society president. I'm the one who's been pushing for reforms for years, and now they're attacking me as some kind of Neanderthal conservative. What they're doing is destroying the party. What they're doing is giving an advantage to Ho Chi Minh and the communists in Vietnam. They're going to lose Vietnam for us. They're going to destroy the Democratic Party. They're going to put the conservatives in power, and this is a self-defeating, self-destructive act on their part. And as it turned out, there was a lot of truth to what he had to say. Johnson's strategy was to win the war as quickly as he could. See, he initially thought that the war in Vietnam could be won in some 12 to 18 months. That was his hope. Of course, the famous saying at the time was, light at the end of the tunnel. They kept saying there's light at the end of the tunnel. They kept predicting that the war was going to reach the win phase, as it was called, in 6 months or 8 months or 9 months. And some very smart person at the time said, sometimes the light at the end of the tunnel is from an onrushing train. Well, there wasn't light at the end of the tunnel. The war kept going on and on. He kept having hopes that we could get done with it quickly, that he could bring the North Vietnamese to the bargaining table, that we work out some kind of negotiated settlement, that we would save South Vietnam from this communist menace or attack. But he didn't get that. And it was too late for him, but he felt that he might be saving the Democratic Party if he stepped aside and didn't run in '68. I think he appreciated that for him to run would have meant the destruction of the party, would have meant such terrible division that the Republicans were going to come into the White House. So he steps aside. The mass of Americans by 1969, by the beginning of the 70s, again, like in the 50s, are tired of government activism. They see the Kennedy-Johnson years as an interlude or a period in which certain things needed to be done. They see the civil rights laws as worth maintaining. They see Medicare and Medicaid and federal aid to education as valuable programs which they wish to leave in place. But they're tired of federal activism. They're put off by affirmative action. They're put off by the call, the appeal to a liberal reform crusade. And like in the 50s and like in the 20s after World War I, they want to revert to a kind of old-fashioned conservatism. They want more conservative leadership. They want less government activism. They want less in the way of taxes. They want to be left alone by the government, so to speak. The new conservatism of the 70s rested upon 2 or 3 propositions. One was that there had been too much social activism on the part of the federal government, that there was too much in the way of there was a relaxed social ethical standard in the country, and that people wanted to see a reversion to old-fashioned American ideals. Let's have more morality, a greater premium on religion, on the family, on a kind of honesty in government, on people being left alone to do their own thing, lower taxes, freedom to spend your money the way you want, a greater self-indulgence if people choose to have that. And of course it's embodied in Ronald Reagan's later appeal to the idea that goes back to the Jeffersonian proposition that the government that governs least is the government that governs best. And so what you have is a desire for less government, greater morality in the society, a greater degree of traditional family attitudes and values. The activism of the 60s, which had these broad gauge goals for civil rights and for defeating poverty in the country, in a sense the activists become splintered. They turn into much more special interest groups. There is the women's rights movement. There continues to be a civil rights movement, but there is a movement for American Indian rights. There's a movement of Chicanos who are demanding greater equality and opportunity for Mexican Americans. What you get is a kind of splintering of the elderly. The elderly become much more content with their lot, what with Medicare and the reallocation of income under the reform programs of the previous 30 or so years. The elderly begin to be much better off than they had been before. Poverty also had been largely cut in half by the Johnson Great Society programs. It went from something like 22-23% in the country down to something like 11 or 12%. But the activists, I think, splinter. They split apart into much more sort of special interest movements, and they don't have a kind of cohesiveness. They don't have a spokesman in the federal government. To this day, who is the great spokesman or spokesperson for the left, for the radicals in the United States government? Can you think of a single person? There's no one. There's no one on the scene. Who is the great Democratic leader? Jesse Jackson is the only one. And how many people would give him a really good chance of becoming president of the United States? I doubt that there are very many who see him as a likely successful presidential candidate.